Hi, everyone. So this is the fourth module for the BioC32 short communications assignment. And as you can see, this module is about human research ethics. So you're coming to this module having just successfully completed the third module about study design, wherein you designed a study that would allow you to answer the novel research question that you proposed back in module two. And I want to begin this module by emphasizing that we have already approved your study design. That's why you're now here at module number four. And no matter what the outcome of this particular module is, that is to say, no matter how unethical it turns out that your approved study design is, you're not going to have to make any changes to that study design. And the reason for that is pretty obvious, I think. It's because you're not actually going to be conducting your study using real human participants. As you know, you are instead going to be using HUMOD, which is this human physiology simulation program. That's how you're going to carry out your study. And I'm certainly of the opinion that we do not have to treat simulated human beings with the same kind of ethics and respect and dignity that we would have to treat real human participants. So, again, your study design has been approved. And no matter what the outcome of this module in terms of how ethical or unethical your approved study design is, we're not going to send you back to module three to make changes to ensure that your study design complies with human research ethics requirements. Okay, so I just wanted to make that very clear up front. Now, where I really and truly want to begin this module is by spending a little time talking about an example of an unethical human research study that was conducted right here in Canada. So, what you're looking at on the screen are some photographs of the Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School that was located in Kenora, Ontario. So, the top left photograph shows the exterior of the school, and the bottom right photograph shows the children and their teacher within this school. And I chose that bottom right photograph very carefully because the date on that photograph was from the late 1940s. And that's the exact era when these unethical research studies that I am about to talk about were conducted. And so it kind of dawned on me as I was looking at the faces of these indigenous children in this residential school, that these might actually be the faces of the actual children who were subjected to the unethical research study that I'm about to talk about. So I think if you just look at these faces and you kind of look into the eyes for just a moment, you can sort of have a little bit of sympathy for how these individuals were treated without the kind of respect and dignity that is owed to every human being. So, just to begin with a little bit of context for how these unethical research studies came to be. So, the residential schools had been around for much longer prior to the 1940s. And as it says here, Indigenous parents had been complaining of widespread hunger in these schools for decades. But it wasn't until the 1940s when government officials went and investigated these schools for themselves that it was officially recognized that there was a nutrition problem within the Canadian residential schools. And so the man who was put in charge of trying to rectify the hunger and the nutrition problem in these schools was the man photographed here, Dr. Percy Moore. Dr. Moore, as it says, was the superintendent of medical services for what at the time was known as the Department of Indian Affairs. And, you know, I want to just talk a little bit about Dr. Moore himself because I think sometimes we have a tendency to think about unethical research studies and we imagine that the individuals who were responsible for these studies were like amoral, heartless humans. And of course, I don't think that's really true for Dr. Percy Moore. There is still today even a hospital here in Canada that services First Nations, Inuit, and Aboriginal communities that bears Percy Moore's name. And I did a little research before recording this module to see whether there have been any widespread calls for Percy Moore's name to be stripped from this hospital, and really couldn't find many. There was certainly one document I read written by an Indigenous author who certainly lamented the fact that Percy Moore's name was on this hospital, given his connection to the unethical research studies that I'm about to talk about. But I think that there are just as many people who feel that Percy Moore actually was trying to make a positive contribution to the health of these Indigenous communities, and therefore are actually happy to see his name on this hospital. So as you're going to see here, I guess Percy Moore and really anybody involved in this unethical research study that I'm talking about here, they all have sort of a complicated history. And I know that right now we're in an era where we want to judge history in very black and white terms, but the reality is that nothing in life is so simple in black and white. And so perhaps you'll come to have a better appreciation for that as we progress through this module. In any case, just to kind of illustrate again that Percy Moore was not this heartless individual who simply was like, "Hey, let's go out and carry out studies on Indigenous children in these schools." Percy Moore, in his role as the superintendent of medical services for the Department of Indian Affairs, I mean, he was responsible for the health and the welfare of the children in these schools. And it was reported, as it says here on the screen, that Moore was troubled by what he had observed himself in these schools during the war. So during the Second World War, he was going out to many of these residential schools. He was checking on the conditions there. He was troubled by what he himself was seeing. And he was also troubled, as it says here, by reports that were reaching his desk from schools that he had not attended, where there were reports suggesting that, again, there was a nutrition problem in these schools. So again, Dr. Percy Moore was not somebody who didn't care, at all about these children that were in these residential schools. By all accounts that I can read and substantiate, it seems like he actually was deeply concerned about the welfare of the children in these schools, and he actually set out to try and solve the problem, and he did so by teaming up with a guy named Dr. Lionel Pett. As it says here, Dr. Pett was the Director of Nutritional Services for the Department of Pensions and National Health. So he was essentially the man who was in charge of the health and welfare of the rest of the country, the non Indigenous part of the country. And so Moore and Pett teamed up and they worked together to try and figure out how can we solve the nutrition problem going on in the residential schools across this country. And their first action was actually to establish a rigorous investigation system where investigators would routinely go out to the kitchens of these residential schools, and they would make observations, they would report on problems they had seen, and they would make recommendations for how to improve the situation. Excuse me. The problem with this investigation approach, actually, I guess first I was just going to show a picture here of one of the kitchens in these residential schools. Here you can see several Indigenous girls together with the Catholic nun here in the kitchen. If you know a little bit about residential schools, you'll know that the Catholic Church, together, of course, with the Anglican Church and many Presbyterian churches, they were actually tasked by the government to run these schools. So that explains why the nun is here, kind of assisting with the food preparation in this kitchen. Again, this picture is from that sort of 1940s era. But the problem with the investigation process that these two men came up with was very much summarized by Alice McCready, who was the lead investigator. She said, "How can a report on each one of these schools be effective if it is to be a repetition of the first report?" She basically was saying, look, we have investigators going into all these schools, into all these kitchens, seeing that the nutrition problem exists, making recommendations for how to solve the problem, but then nothing actually changes. And so we go back the next time and it's the same problems, the same recommendations, were just beating our heads against the wall. And the reason nothing was changing was mostly because the federal government just was not interested in putting money into improving the nutritional condition. So they knew what had to be done, right? The investigators were making recommendations. They knew what the problems are. They knew what had to be done, but the federal government just simply wasn't willing to invest money into meeting those recommendations. And so Dr. Pett, kind of realizing that he was not going to be able to solve the problem in residential schools through this investigation and recommendation process, he decided to take a different approach. And we actually have to learn a little bit about Dr. Pett's background here to realize that he came to this position as the director of nutritional services after having spent an extensive amount of time as a nutrition researcher. And we also have to recognize that the field of nutrition research was actually just beginning at this point. It was really kind of the 1920s and the 1930s when the idea of nutrition science actually evolved and became a field. And so there was a lot of research being done at that time on nutrition, but of course, a lot of the research was being done exclusively in things like rats. Just to give you a little context here, there's a couple of papers, one from 1937, one from 1943. So right in this era that we're talking about, the physiology of zinc in the nutrition of the rat, studies of boron in the nutrition of the rat. So we were just starting to learn about different nutrients and their role in health, but a lot of the work was being done exclusively in rats and mice and I think dogs as well. And there was a growing feeling among nutritional researchers that wouldn't it be really nice if we could start carrying out some of these studies on human population? And so, in that context, Dr. Lionel Pett decided that, hey, these residential schools that I now have this relationship with, that I'm supposed to be helping to solve the nutritional problem inside of, I could actually use the students there as research participants, and I could start trying to figure out. I can start conducting research on them about nutrition. And again, I don't want it to seem as if Dr. Pett was just thinking like, "Oh, I've got this access to this population I can work on." Again, he decided that the research route was going to be the way that he could solve the nutrition problem. Excuse me, was going to be the way that he might solve the nutrition problem within these schools. And really, kind of the broad question. I know I have a very specific question here, but kind of the broad question that Dr. Pett, as well as Percy Moore, they were working together here. The kind of broad question that they wanted to answer was, well, what's the minimum that we have to do to improve the nutrition of the students in these residential schools? Because if we can identify the minimum that we have to do, then we can pitch that to the government and say, hey, for this very small investment of money that we're going to ask you, we can show you that this is how you can maximize the impact of that investment on in terms of nutrition. And so where Dr. Peck kind of decided to focus first is on this idea of, well, if we were to feed these indigenous children foods fortified with vitamins and minerals, will we actually see improvement in their health over the course of a 5-year study? So, right again in this time of the 1930s and 40s, this idea of fortifying foods with vitamins and minerals was becoming kind of an attractive idea. It wasn't something that was necessarily being widespread at this point. I think already in Canada, there was like iodized salt, for example, was already a thing at this time. But Dr. Pett decided that he could do a study with these indigenous children, basically looking at this nutritionally impoverished population and figure out if feeding them foods fortified with vitamins and minerals could actually improve their health or not. Um, so that's the broad research question that they set out to answer. I have a photograph here now in the bottom right corner. This is actually one of the researchers on the project taking blood samples from an indigenous child here because yeah, I mean this is part of the work they had to do. They were feeding them these fortified foods, feeding some of them these fortified foods anyways, and others, of course, were not getting the fortified foods to serve as a control. And you might be already able to see there the ethical issue with that. But they were then taking blood samples and other measurements to assess how the health of these individuals was changing. And so the study was actually conducted beginning in 1947, and they ended it in early 1952. And then Dr. Pett actually went to the annual meeting of the American Institute of Nutrition, which, as you can see here, was held in New York in 1952, April of 1952. And he presented the findings of his study. And what the study had actually shown, very interestingly, one of the specific outcomes of this study was that iron enriched flour actually led to a decrease in hemoglobin levels in children. So, anemia, right, which is a lack of red blood cells, a lack of hemoglobin in the blood, anemia was widespread in these residential schools. And so, one of the fortified foods that these kids were being fed as part of the study was this iron enriched flour. And interestingly, as a bit of a side note here, this flower was actually coming from Newfoundland, which at the time when this study began in 1947 was not yet part of Canada. So it actually turns out, this is the interesting thing too, is that these researchers were actually illegally importing this iron enriched flour from Newfoundland into Canada, contravening the Food and Drug Act of Canada at the time, to actually carry out this study. So again, I guess you can say like these researchers were kind of taking a bit of a legal risk in order to conduct this study. I think it's because they really thought that they were going to be able to perhaps benefit the population of children that they were doing or working with. But interestingly enough, as you see here, as I already mentioned, um, the feeding of this iron enriched flour to the children in these residential schools actually decreased their hemoglobin levels further, actually made their anemia worse. And so Dr. Pett, part of this presentation he was giving to the Institute of Nutrition here, suggested that further physiological research on the safety of food to which chemicals have been added is necessary. He actually was convinced by this research that adding vitamins and minerals to food wasn't going to be a very successful way to deal with nutritional problems within populations. And obviously, his position was a bit buoyed here by the research that he had been able to conduct with these indigenous school children. Again, just wanting to give a little bit of context to this unethical study. So in 2000, there was an article published in the Anglican Journal. The Anglican Journal is the official newspaper of the Anglican Church of Canada. So as I mentioned earlier, Catholic as well as Anglican and Presbyterian churches were actually tasked by the government to run these residential schools. So a reporter from the Anglican Journal wrote this piece about Ottawa experimenting on Native kids. And as part of the article, he interviewed Lionel Pett, who was 80 or 90 rather, sorry, at the time, and asked him about, do you think in retrospect that these studies that you were so instrumental in performing, were they in fact unethical studies? And as it says here, and this is a clip from the article, Dr. Pett, his argument was, look, we were doing these studies, we were sharing the findings of the studies with the schools themselves, with the broader indigenous communities. We were doing this research because we felt it was going to help improve the nutritional situation, not only in these residential schools, but in the wider indigenous communities that were also experiencing hunger and nutritional issues. So, now we would call this kind of a classical kind of ends justifies the means, right? It doesn't matter if we do an unethical study because it was for the betterment of the community and we were sharing what we were learning with the community. Of course, anybody who's studied any kind of critical thinking or logic courses will know that ends justifies the means is often considered to be a bit of a logical fallacy. But um, what I'm hoping you can kind of see here is that, again, Lionel Pett himself was not someone who looked at these indigenous children and thought, oh, here's just a room full of guinea pigs I can do experiments on. he felt that this was going to be a way to solve the nutrition crisis that he, together with Percy Moore, had been tasked to solve. Interestingly, in 2015, the Toronto Star also ran an article. Now, by this point, Lionel Pett had passed away, but they talked to his son about these nutritional experiments that his father had conducted in the 1940s. And again, when they asked the son, "Do you feel like your father's work was unethical?" His response was basically, he was just trying to do good work, right? So again, Lionel Pett's son, who again is not himself a researcher, not involved in this in any way, when he just looked at his father's work, he said, look, all he was trying to do was help the children in these communities. He was trying to figure out how can we improve their nutrition, and he wanted to do research to figure out what would be successful in terms of correcting the nutritional problem in these residential schools so that he could go to the government with an actual tangible demonstrable plan in hand. Again, it's this whole ends justifies the means. We can't do things unethically just because we think the results of the studies are going to be beneficial and maybe help to improve the situation in the future. But you could again get some sense here that both Percy Moore and Lionel Pett, they were really trying to solve a problem with their research. And although they did things in an unethical way, again, they were motivated by the fact that they felt that their results and the work they were going to be doing and the outcomes of these research studies would be beneficial to the people on whom the research was being conducted. Now, what I want to do at this point, because I've talked about this study now, and I've kind of hinted, of course, at the fact that the study was unethical, I just want to talk briefly about, well, what specific unethical issues were there with the study? Number one, of course, is the fact that the study was being conducted by government researchers, right? Who only had access to the population of children they did because they were wards of the state. I mean, if you've learned anything about residential schools, you know that all these indigenous children were basically rounded up by the government and forced against their will into these government run schools. So now you've got government researchers who are basically conducting research on these children whom the government had stolen from their families and forced into these residential schools. You can imagine that the capacity of these children to say, no, I don't want to be part of your study, just wasn't going to be there, right? These were children who'd already been forced into these schools away from their homes. They clearly had no choice in that matter. How were they possibly going to feel that they had a choice in whether or not they participated in these nutrition studies? And we're going to talk about the idea that voluntary participation is such a cornerstone feature of ethical human research studies. We'll come back to that point. Number two was the fact that parental consent was rarely sought, right? And in fact, there's an interesting quote from a paper on this whole residential schools nutrition study. The quote said that the Indian has the psychology of a child. Avoid alarming him by explaining procedures he will not understand. So the researchers, and this is perhaps again where the Lionel Pett Percy Moore story becomes a bit difficult to pick sides on, is obviously they wanted to solve the problem. They wanted to improve nutrition in the residential schools, but they didn't think it was worthwhile going to the parents of these children and saying, "Is it okay if we conduct this research? Here's what we think the risks and the benefits are going to be." Instead, Pett and Moore, they just decided that it was better to go ahead and do the studies. Don't consult the parents because the parents are Indian. They're basically childlike in their mentality. And if we try to explain to them what we're doing, they're just going to freak out and then we're going to have a problem on our hands. So obviously, that was a highly unethical thing to have done. And of course, it was motivated by um, a complete indignant approach to indigenous parents. And then, of course, thirdly, prior to actually doing any kind of dietary intervention, such as feeding them this iron enriched flour, as it says here, all the children in these studies were kept on what was known to be a nutritionally deficient diet for 2 years to establish what the researchers call baseline conditions. So, although they knew that these kids were being fed this nutritionally poor food, they decided to keep feeding it to them for the next 2 years so they would know what the baseline conditions for hemoglobin and other parameters would be. And then they could make a comparison against the dietary fortification approach. So, again, you can look at these three aspects and you can say to yourself, yes, this was clearly an unethical study. And what I also want to really emphasize here, and this was emphasized actually in one of the papers I was reading about this whole study, is that again, this study was not only unethical by today's standards, right? We have this lovely way here in Canada of trying to take the standards of today and judge everything in history by those standards. Um, Not only was this study an unethical by today's standards, but it was also unethical by the research standards of the time of the 1940s. Okay, so this is not just us going back into history and judging the researchers of the past and saying, hey, based on the way we do things now in 2024 or whenever you happen to be reading this or watching this video, not only this just isn't unethical by today's standards, it was unethical also by the standards of time. So hopefully, by giving you that little story of this Canadian unethical research, it sets the stage then for the second half of the video, which is going to begin here by asking the question, well, why should human research be ethical? Yes, we can recognize that there was this unethical research that was being done on these indigenous children in residential schools back in the 1940s. And by the way, I should perhaps say here that, you know, don't be duped into thinking that I had to go back into the 1940s to get examples of unethical research studies that, oh, unethical research studies don't happen today. They're still happening today. They're especially happening in the global south. There are a lot of pharmaceutical companies, for example, that have shifted a lot of their research operations into the global south, where they feel that they can get away with more of these ethical violations without being subjected to the rigorous kind of standards that we have in Canada or the US or Europe or wherever. But I chose that example from the 1940s just because, it was also, it's perhaps the shining example, at least within Canada, it's the shining example of unethical research studies. But definitely these things still go on today. So I want to switch gears here and ask this question: why should human research be ethical? I think that there are two kind of broad answers to the question. The first is that we need to do ethical research in order to ensure the integrity of science. And what I really want to highlight here is that scientific integrity, or at least the perception of scientific integrity, is very much on the decline. This is an American survey. It was done by Gallup, but they asked US adults, and then, of course, they separate them out here as they often do in the States by their political leaning. But they asked them a question, which is, do you have confidence in scientists? And it turns out that if you go back to 1975, 70% of US adults said they had confidence in scientists. And it was pretty consistent across the different political groups. But in 2021, which admittedly was in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, so that may be skewing things a bit here. But in 2021, the percentage of US adults who had confidence in scientists had dropped down to 64%, and it had especially dropped within Republicans. So, what we're finding, of course, is that Republicans, who tend to be on the kind of right wing of the political spectrum, conservatives, if you want to use that more common term here in Canada, I mean, they seem to be losing confidence in public institutions pretty broadly, including science. So, the reality I think here is that scientific integrity is on the decline. Okay, across the US, and I think you'd find similar data here in Canada and probably other Western countries, there's this growing feeling that science is acting in scrupulous ways, right? And So the reality is that every time that some kind of unethical research study gets done, and especially when it hits the news media and gets publicized, that further erodes the confidence that people have in scientists. Because if you want science to be viewed with integrity, then you, of course, need to ensure that the people who conduct science hold themselves to that highest standard, right? As soon as we start having a perception in the public that scientists will just do whatever and whatever they need to do to guarantee their own personal success or get the results they want or whatever, as soon as people see that scientists are willing to act in unethical ways to get what they want, then that erodes the integrity of the entire scientific field. So this is, I think, one reason why we need to do ethical research with humans is to help to preserve and build back this concept of scientific integrity, because science has served us very well for many centuries, and it's important that we don't allow the perception of science as can't allow scientific integrity to erode, because if people lose faith in science, then they start to lose faith in medicine, they start to lose faith in technology. I mean, we just start witnessing this backsliding of humanity, I think, if we start to lose scientific integrity. In any case, the other answer to this question, why should we do ethical research, is that we need to do ethical research as a way to guarantee the rights and dignity of each human individual. In this context, I want to talk about a couple of international covenants that I think are actually very relevant to this topic. So there's an international covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. And if you read Article 12 of this covenant, it talks about the promotion of medical research and health education and fostering recognition of factors favoring positive health results, for example, research. So the reality is that we have this international covenant, right, that the vast majority of the countries of the world have signed on to, where we recognize that doing research, medical research, to figure out how we can improve human health, like human research is important. Okay. The international community recognizes that there is an importance to human research. So I think that's an important thing for us to recognize. There's not a widespread call across humanity to say, stop doing research on humans. We should never do research on humans. Okay. Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights shows that the international community recognizes that human research is important. It's important for helping us to understand how we can live healthy lives. But then we have a second covenant that's also equally important here, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 7 of which very clearly states that no one shall be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. And so I think that these two international covenants very much show us the balancing act that we're trying to accomplish when we do human research. We recognize that human research is important for helping to guarantee and improve the health of the human population, but we need to balance that against the fact that we can't forcibly have people go into human research studies. So it's important to recognize that this balancing act exists, and we can't tip too far in favor of either side, right? If we tip too far in favor of saying, okay, well, we're going to not do any research because we think that's the only way that we can guarantee that people are treated with the kinds of rights and dignity that they deserve, is by never being part of a research study. Well, then of course we're going to suffer when it comes to understanding how do we improve human health. How do we actually improve lifespans and health spans and all these things? But if we tip too far in favor of saying that, research is super important and therefore we're going to force people into research studies, even if they don't want to be part of them, and that's a problem too. So we need to maintain that good balance between these two sides of these two different international covenants. The next question I want to talk about here is who ensures that human research is ethical? And the answer might surprise you. It's largely accomplished at the institutional level. So it's the institutions themselves who conduct research on humans they are largely responsible for the oversight of their own research. Now, I think that there are some national and international level bodies that provide kind of broader guidelines, but for the most part, the institutions themselves are sort of self-governing on this point. If we think specifically about the University of Toronto Scarborough, so we have what's called the Office of the Vice Principal, Research and Innovation. It's that particular office that is responsible for ensuring that researchers are compliant with any guidelines on human and also animal research, as you can see here. And if you look on the screen where it says human subjects research, and you kind of go down to the bottom, it also mentions the Office of Research Ethics. So that is a University of Toronto tri-campus office that also then has oversight of the Office of the Vice Principal Research and Innovation at the University of Toronto Scarborough. So largely, we have these kind of research offices, these research offices at U of T that are largely responsible for ensuring that any human and as well as animal research done on campus conforms to both national and international agreements on both animal and human research ethics. So how exactly does it work then here at UTSC? Let's say I want to do a study where I'm going to be investigating a human population. So let's say you wanted to actually do your study that you have had approved on some real people as opposed to using HumMod, which of course we're not going to do in the context of this course. But let's just imagine you wanted to do this as a D98 project or something down the road. Um, so the way it works here at UTSC is you go through something called My Research Human Protocol. And the first thing you have to do is you have to fill out this extensive document. So it says here original submission. So you're going to go through this extensive document that's going to make you think about, every ethical aspect of your study that you could possibly imagine, and you're going to complete that document. And then that document is going to go off to a research ethics board where they're going to review it. And in 90% of cases, they're going to send it back to you with modifications. Okay. They're usually going to say, we need you to modify your protocols in this, that, or the other way in order for them to comply with ethical standards. So you'll make your submission. You'll probably have it rejected initially, asking you to make changes. You go through, you make those changes, and then eventually the document will probably be approved, so long as it's not got too many ethical issues with it. And once the document has been approved, then you're able to carry out the research. And of course, you are bound to follow exactly what you said you would do in the protocol. Now, a couple of things you'll notice here. One is that amendments to that protocol after it's been approved are possible. So sometimes you start doing the research and then you realize, well, this protocol that I'm using isn't really working the way I thought it would. It'd be better if we did it some other way. Okay. And oftentimes you don't really know how a research study is actually going to take place until you actually do it. So amendments are possible. Again, they go through that same rigorous approval process. And obviously you can't change your protocol, what you're actually doing with the participants until the amendment has been approved. But amendments are possible. And then you'll also notice here that every year the protocol goes through an automatic renewal process where you go back through the document and you make sure that you can make changes at that time. But ultimately, it's a chance for everybody, both the researcher and the research ethics board, to just have a look at the protocol again, make sure that there aren't any maybe changes that need to be made, maybe to update it to there are changing ethical procedures or things like that. So it goes through a renewal process every year. And then once the study is done, whenever that is, in this case, it was a 7-year study, then you fill out what's called a protocol completion report to basically say, I'm now done carrying out this study. I'm not going to need this protocol anymore. Here were the major findings of the study. Do I think it had a net benefit or net liability on the people that were involved, things like that. That is the end of the process. So that's kind of the process in general. Now, the other thing you'll notice if you look down in the bottom right, it talks about other document types. There's a protocol deviation report. So anytime you actually deviate from your approved protocol, you have to fill out a report to say we deviated from this protocol and this is why, and just to make sure it's on the record. Obviously, you can't just do that willy nilly. Usually, the protocol deviation is an accident, right? Somebody did something wrong. And there's also the adverse event report. So if one of your human participants experience some kind of adverse event during the course of your study, that needs to be reported as well. One of the thoughts that might be going through your mind at this point is, well, imagine that I'm a researcher and I'm in the room with my human participant and I'm doing, this research study, and I do accidentally deviate from the protocol. And I realize it at some point, shit, I was supposed to have done X, but I did Y. Or maybe I do X and then the patient has like a spasm or something. And oh, damn, that's weird. Um, why would I actually report that? You might say to yourself. Why don't I try to just hide that? Wouldn't that be like the path of least resistance? And my response to that would be that I think this is exactly the reason why anytime you're doing research with real human participants, there should always be two researchers involved. Okay. So whenever you have that participant in a room and you're giving injections or taking measurements or whatever, there should always be two researchers in that room. Because yes, if there's one researcher, that one researcher might say, you know what, I don't want to have to fill out a protocol deviation report. This injecting with X when I was supposed to inject with Y, it's a minor thing. I don't want to have to make it a big deal. I don't want to have to fill out paperwork. I'll just ignore it. That can happen if there's one person in a room. But if there are two people in the room, then of course each is going to hold the other to account. So I would strongly suggest that whenever you're doing research with human participants, there should never be just one researcher at any time carrying out the study. Every part of the study should always have two researchers just to make sure, again, that each is keeping the other accountable. And we're making sure, again, that we are preserving the dignity and the respect of our human participants. All right, the last question I want to talk about here is how do we ensure that human research is ethical? So I'm going to go through here kind of the four answers to that question, a bit of detail. Answer number one is voluntary participation, which I was talking about before. I was talking about how the students in the residential schools really were not willing participants in that study, right? They had been forced into the schools against their will. They certainly didn't feel that they could say, I don't want to be part of this nutritional study. Voluntary participation is considered to be one of the cornerstones of how we ensure that human research is ethical. And again, that also aligns with Article 7 from the International Covenant on these civil and political rights that I was talking about earlier. Now, how do we actually make sure that participation is voluntary? Well, number one, or I guess what does that mean? It means we can't pressure or coerce people into our study. Okay. So, if you want to recruit people into your study, you probably have seen campus flyers on campus for research studies. They put up a flyer on the board. They say, hey, we're looking for participants to join our research study. If you're interested, email this person. You would not want to be standing out there with the flyer in your hand saying, hey, want to be involved in a research process? Want to be involved in a research program? And start shoving flyers into people's faces or trying to sign them up on the spot because they're going to feel pressured or coerced. So we can't pressure and we can't coerce people to join our study. Number two, to ensure voluntary participation, we need to make it clear that participants can withdraw from the study at any point without needing to give a reason, right? So again, it's only voluntary if people can make the decision to come in, but also make the decision to come out at any point. And very importantly, without needing to give a reason, which means that you as the researcher can't ask. I know it's frustrating sometimes. You might think, well, shit, this participant, they were, there's only 2 weeks to go and the study's going to end and I'll get all the data I need. And they're now saying they want to leave. And again, you can't pressure them, coerce them. You can't say, oh, there's just 2 weeks left. Why don't you just hang on? That again is an unethical violation. But you also can't ask them why they're leaving. You can't say, well, is there anything I could do that convince you to stay? Or can you just tell me why you're leaving so that maybe in the future I can make the study better or conditions better? You can't even ask them that question, right? Because just asking the question alone could serve as pressure or coercion. You also need to be very clear to the participants that there is no consequences or repercussions for their lack of participation or withdrawal, right? So if somebody decides that they're not going to be in your study, or if they decide that they're going to pull out of your study, you have to make it clear to them that that's fine, right? You're not compelled to join, you're not compelled to stay. And of course, you have to follow through with that as well, right? If someone leaves the study, you can't say, well, I'm going to make sure that I never, we're not going to pay them their fee for coming the last time because they're not coming in the future. Like you cannot penalize someone for not participating or choosing to withdraw from your study. That again is part of this idea of voluntary participation. It's also important for us to recognize that the idea of voluntary participation is especially important when we're working with vulnerable groups, right? Because vulnerable groups, by definition, are groups of people who may feel pressured or coerced more easily than other groups. Okay. And so, who is a vulnerable group? Who do we have to be especially thinking about here? Well, we have to think about people with limited cognitive or communication capacity, right? We don't want someone who has limited cognitive understanding to join a study simply because they didn't actually understand what they were getting themselves into. So we'll talk more about this when we talk about informed consent in a moment, but it's really important that we make sure that we are talking to people when it comes to, are you interested in joining this study or not, that we're talking to them at a level that they can understand. So again, that they can participate without feeling like they joined without truly understanding what it is they were getting themselves into. People subjected to power imbalances. And it gives a few examples here: students, employees, prisoners, spouses. If you're dealing with any of these populations, you have to be concerned, especially in the context of, say, I'm doing a study of grade 7 students at a school. You don't want these students to feel like they're being forced in because their teacher wanted them to get them in. Employees could feel that their employer is pressuring them in. Prisoners could feel that the government or wardens are pressuring them in. Spouses too, right? If you're doing a study, for example, where you want to investigate, how spouses are dealing with whatever, I don't know what the study would be, but you want to make sure that, for example, a husband isn't joining just because his wife is and pressuring him to do so, or vice versa. So whenever there's the potential for power imbalances, we really need to make sure that the lower folks on that power totem pole, that they aren't feeling coerced or pressured in by those folks higher up on that totem pole. So in any case, got to keep that in mind. People with medical conditions. So especially if they have medical conditions that pertain to your study, because what we don't want is we don't want people joining the study not because they don't want to, but because they're hoping that this is going to be their miracle cure. Now, if you're doing a study about cancer, for example, and you're trying to figure out, okay, we have this new medication that we think might help to slow down the growth of liver cancer or something. You don't want people joining your study simply because they think this is my shot at getting cured of cancer. Because again, it's almost like we're pressuring them or coercing them in through making them feel like they might actually be able to live a longer life if they join our study, right? So we have to be very careful that people who have medical conditions, especially when we're doing this kind of medical research, that again, we don't give them false hope, and that we don't get them into our study using that false hope. People with limited financial means, we also have to be careful here too, because one of the things it talks about is they might seek free care. I think this is a bit more important in the United States, where you have to pay for all your health care. But even in Canada, there are certain aspects of healthcare that we pay for, dental care, eye care, these sorts of things. So, if you're doing a study where you're saying, okay, we want to do a study to assess this new drug for cataracts or something, you don't necessarily want people again coming into your study simply because they think, oh, if I go into the study, they're going to pay for all this cataract medication that I need, and I won't have to pay for it out of pocket. Again, we have to be a bit careful about luring people into our studies simply because they are cash strapped. We don't want to be seen as exploiting the socioeconomically disadvantaged when we're doing research. And also, it mentions here compensation. Again, we don't want to pay people to participate in research, because again, that is a way that we could exploit the poor. So typically, when you're doing any kind of compensation for a research study, it's very minimal compensation. You might compensate someone very minimally for their time, or very minimally for their travel, or their daycare, or whatever. But we can't be saying, oh, okay, well, we're going to pay $10,000 to every person who participates in this study. Because again, we may end up coercing economically disadvantaged folks to coming to our study because they want the money. And of course, then people who have wealth will feel like, okay, I don't have to subject myself to these guinea pig conditions because I have wealth. I don't need that money. So we generally don't compensate people very well for research studies, and we have to be cognizant of people who might be joining simply because they feel as though they're going to get free care and not have to pay these out of pocket expenses. And then, of course, children. For obvious reasons, children are also a very vulnerable population. Thinking back to our residential school experiments that I talked about earlier today. I'll talk more about children in just a moment here. But again, especially when you're working with any of these vulnerable groups, you really need to do everything in your power to ensure that their participation in the study is voluntary. And that, of course, everybody's participation needs to be voluntary. But those who have these who belong to these particularly vulnerable groups, we need to ensure that we are not inadvertently coercing them into our study through various means. Number two, in terms of how do we ensure that research is ethical, is we need to ensure informed consent, right? So we need to make sure that not only are the people voluntarily participating in our study, but that they are consenting to be in our study because we've provided them with all the necessary information for them to make that decision. So the basic idea here is that potential participants have to be provided with all the information needed to make a decision about their participation. So we can't just say to someone on the side of the road, hey, do you want to be part of this study on, part of the study on, how Coca-Cola affects your sleep, and then they just say, okay, yeah, I'm just going to join based on that limited information. We need to make sure that we're providing them with all the information they need to decide will they participate or not. So what information specifically do we need to provide them with before they can actually join the study? Well, we need to tell them the objectives of the study. Why are we doing this? Right? What is the purpose of this study? We need to tell them about the potential risks and benefits of their participation, especially the risks, which we're going to go into more about here in a second. We need to tell them about the time commitment that is required. So are they going to have to just, spend 45 minutes with us once, or is it going to be a weekly commitment or a yearly commitment or whatever? And we also need to provide them with the contact information of the principal investigator so that if they have any other questions, they can reach out and get those questions answered before they make the decision to join the research study. So that's the information that needs to be provided. We also need to think about how are we going to present this information. Usually the way it's done is through a consent letter. So generally, if you're going to join a research study as a human participant, you're going to be given a letter, right? And you'll be able to read all these things I just talked about. Here's the objectives. Here are the risks. Here's the time commitment. Here's the contact info. You can read all that. You can say, okay, yep, I understand all these things. I want to join. I will sign my name. The problem, again, is that it's not always that straightforward. You do have to think, for example, about the literacy skills of your potential participant, right? Because if I am giving people a consent letter to read, are they going to be able to actually read and fully understand the information that's presented? So maybe you think about the fact that, okay, am I working with, maybe I'm working with, I don't know, again, I could be working with a group of people who have cognitive or communication issues, as we talked about on the previous slide. So is giving a consent letter to someone who has cognitive difficulties? Maybe I want to do an Alzheimer's study and I'm giving a consent letter to an older patient who has dementia. Is it really reasonable to expect that they're going to fully understand what they're reading in the consent letter to be able to sign and give their permission? And also English competency as well, right? So do I have to perhaps provide the consent letter in a different language, right? Because maybe the person who I'm trying to recruit is English as a second language or a third language or a fourth language or whatever, and they don't really understand fully the information. maybe I should provide it to them in the language of their choice. So again, we have to make sure that we are providing people with the information to make an informed consent. And again, it's up to it's the onus is on us to make sure that we're providing that information in a way that is comprehensible, fully comprehensible to our participants. And then, of course, I'm going to come back here to children for a moment. So it's important to recognize that legally, children cannot give informed consent. So if I want to do a study on the seventh graders in my wife's classroom, I can't just walk into that classroom one day and say, okay, here are all these consent letters, read them over and sign up to let me know you want to be part of this study. They can't give informed consent. I have to get that consent from their parents or their guardian. Okay. Parents and guardians can give informed consent to a research project on behalf of their children. But at the same time, as it mentions here, I should always seek assent from children. So again, going back to this study, if I wanted to go into a grade 7 classroom and do some sort of study, I would have to send home the consent letter to all the parents, right? And they could read through all the information and say, yep, I consent to my child participating in the study. But I still should then talk to that grade 7 classroom, and I should still get each child to say, yeah, I also would like to participate in this study. It shouldn't be that the parent has made the decision and the kid is sitting there going, I don't want to do any of this. And I say, well, too bad. Mom said you're doing it, right? I should definitely be seeking assent from children where that's possible. Okay. Number 3 is anonymity or confidentiality. Generally, we want to have one or the other of these two components to our study to ensure that our study is ethical. So, what does anonymity mean? Well, it means that you don't know who the participants are. As the researcher, I don't know who the participants are. They're anonymous people. Of course, this is not going to be possible in many research studies. If you're doing any research in person, obviously I'm going to see who the person is as they come to visit me for the research. If I'm doing the research over the phone, again, there can't be anonymity because I'm probably going to know the person's name, or at least I'm going to know their phone number, which is attached to their name. Same with email. So, anonymous research would be research where, say, I have just blasted a bunch of surveys out to people through email, for example, and they click on a link and they fill out my survey, and then there's no identifying features of that person, so I don't know who filled out the survey and who didn't fill out the survey. That would be anonymity, right? And now, again, because I don't know who the research participants are, I obviously can't share any personal information about the individuals and what they said in that survey. Again, as you can imagine, anonymity is not always going to be very easy to achieve, especially in human research, because oftentimes we are going to have these people come in person to have blood samples taken or to work on an exercise bike or whatever. So where anonymity is not possible, then you focus on confidentiality, which means that you're going to protect the personal identifying information of the individuals who are in your study, right? It's not going to be able to be, it's not going to get published, and it's certainly not going to be made available to anybody outside of the research team. How do we do this? How do we ensure confidentiality? Well, there's usually a requirement for any data files that you are collecting to be encrypted and password protected. Okay. So any place where you are putting the identifying information about your participants or any of the data you're collecting, any of those files that you create with that information, there is a requirement that those files be encrypted and that the files themselves be password protected. Okay. So I want to emphasize that it's not just enough to have the laptop that you keep the file on password protected, but the file itself must be password protected as well. And then, of course, you have to ensure that only authorized researchers can access the research file. So the only people who have the password are the researchers who are part of the study. And usually, going back to the my human research protocols that I talked about earlier, you have to usually identify on that protocol who are the authorized researchers. And so if someone's name does not show up on that list, then they should not have access to the research file. We also have to recognize that confidentiality, again, may not always be possible. If you're doing research in groups, then obviously you've got these groups of individuals who are coming together, and person A is going to see person B and know who they are, and maybe even see what data they're giving up. So I think generally you would minimize doing research in groups wherever possible to preserve confidentiality, but you have to make special arrangements in the case where you're doing research in groups to ensure that confidentiality can be, to the best of your ability, preserved. And then fourth and finally here, and this is the part that's really the most important for this whole what you're actually going to do for this module is how do we ensure human research is ethical? Well, we do everything we can to reduce the potential for harm. Okay. And so what you have to do is you have to think about all the possible sources of harm and how could I mitigate these? Right? So, how could people be harmed by participating in my study? And before I even start the study, what could I do in advance to make sure that that likelihood of harm is kept as low as possible? Okay, that's what you have to do. And when you're not able to mitigate a potential source of harm, this is where then the informed consent becomes important because then you have to make sure that in your consent letter you say, here are the risks, right? These are the risks that we were not able to fully mitigate. And so if you participate in this study, these are the risks that you are subjecting yourself to. And people then can decide, okay, are those risks minimal enough that I'm still happy to participate? Or are they too high above my threshold tolerance for risk? And therefore, I'm not going to participate. What I want to talk about next here are the four categories of harms that we should be thinking about when we are designing our study and thinking about how we can mitigate them as much as possible. So there are four categories of harm we have to think about. There's psychological harm, social and economic harm, physical harm, and legal harm. So I want to just go through each of these in a bit of detail. We'll start with psychological harm. So when we're thinking about psychological harm, we're thinking about will our research cause someone emotional discomfort? Okay. And I just list here a few particular emotions that you might think about. You know, worry, upset, depression, embarrassment, shame, or guilt. So just to give you an example, for one example here, let's imagine that we're doing a study where we're going to recruit obese individuals and we're going to have them, be on some kind of strict diet, and we want to assess whether that diet is able to motivate high levels of weight loss or something. It's possible that if this obese person is not able to, let's imagine this obese person is not able to stick to that strict diet. And so they go off and they have some ice cream one day and a pie the next day, and they just kind of went off the diet. It's possible that they could feel shame and guilt and embarrassment for not being able to be strong enough to stay on this strict diet that you had put them on as part of the study. So that would be an example of a psychological harm that we should consider. How can we mitigate that? And it also mentions here that you need to consider the mental and emotional state of your participants, and you may have to exclude some participants, right? So if you are doing a study, for example, where you think, okay, there's a possibility that this we're going to do some kind of study where it might induce depression. We're going to give, I don't know exactly a good example here, but maybe you have a study where there's a possibility that people will become depressed through their participation in this study. You may want to therefore exclude people who have been diagnosed with depression in the past or who have a family history of depression. You may want to screen out people who are likely to experience a substantial degree of psychological harm that your study could cause. So that's what we're talking about as far as psychological harm is considered. For social and economic harm, a couple of things to think about here. One is the risk of being outed, right? So one example they give here is HIV status. So let's say you're doing a study where you want to take HIV positive individuals and you want to give them some kind of drug because you want to see if that can minimize the number of HIV viruses that show up in their semen, for example. The reality is that if somebody is hiding their HIV status from their family, from their friends, if people find out, oh, you're part of this HIV study that's going on, well, does that mean you have HIV? You're outing that person, right? That person could be outed to their community through participation in your study. Same with homosexuality. If you're doing studies where maybe you're recruiting specifically homosexual individuals. So again, that has to be something that you kind of keep in mind. Is it possible that people could be outed in some way or another through their participation in your study? How can we minimize that? Now, obviously, it should be minimized, you would think, through the confidentiality principle we talked about earlier. But even something as simple as, maybe I want to conduct the research, at a neutral site so that the person isn't going into CAMH to do this research and somebody on the street says, "Hey Dave, I saw you going to CAMH the other day. What were you doing in there?" "Oh, I was participating in a study about depression." "Oh, you're depressed, Dave?" Like, you can kind of imagine how we can maybe mitigate that. And then on the social side here, or the economic side rather, it talks about considering the cost of things like travel, childcare, missing work. I talked earlier about compensation. It's perfectly fine to compensate people for these things, right? If someone has to travel to another city to get to your research facility so you can draw blood for them, it's perfectly acceptable to say, "Hey, we're going to pay you $25 to cover the gas that it takes to get here." Okay. They're not profiting, therefore, off of participating in the research, but they're not losing out either. Same with childcare, same with missing work, right? So it's perfectly fine to provide financial compensation to the people who participate in your research to make sure that they're not losing out economically by participating in your research. But again, we should not be having people make money off participating in our research, because that's where the potential for exploitation of financially disadvantaged individuals can occur. There's obviously physical harm, and people often think about this, particularly when they think about research studies. Obviously, physical harm is injury and or death. So we don't want people to get injured or die because they participated in our study. So we need to do whatever we can to make sure that the likelihood of injury or death is minimized. Um, as mentioned here, where we think that there is a possibility for injury or death, then we are required to provide care in these cases, right? So if someone is doing your study, and let's say you are, I don't know, you're injecting them with some kind of drug, and maybe as a result of the injection, they suffer some kind of injury or disease or whatever, the onus again is on the researchers to provide to these individuals the care that they would need because they were injured as part of the research study. You can't simply say, "Oh, you got injured, well, go off to the hospital and take care of that yourself." You are, as the researcher, required to provide that care. And again, as it mentions here, same with psychological harm, we may need to exclude participants whose health conditions increase their likelihood of injury or death. So if we know, for example, that a particular research study we're doing is going to be very hard on a person's liver potentially, then anybody who has, say, hepatitis or has cirrhosis or any kind of liver disorder, we may want to screen them out to make sure that we're not putting them at a particularly high risk for physical injury. And then, of course, lastly is legal harm. And so here's when it mentions under legal harm is researchers actually can be compelled to divulge participant info in court. So, with priests, there's a confidentiality if they hear something from a confessor. With lawyers, if they hear something from a client, they have confidentiality. You're familiar with some of these, like medical doctors. There's this patient doctor confidentiality. There's no such thing as a researcher confidentiality. So we can't be sitting in a courtroom and a judge or a lawyer say to us, "Well, tell us about what one of these research participants told you during one of your sessions." We can't say, "Oh, I claim researcher confidentiality." No such thing exists. So, as it mentions next here, we should make sure that we're only going to collect information on illegal activities when it's necessary, right? Don't get information from your research participants that is going to tell you about their illegal activities that you might therefore have to divulge to a court unless it's absolutely a critical part of your study. It also mentions lastly here that researchers have a duty to report. So if you're doing a research study and say inadvertently through the course of that research study, you come to realize that a child that you've been doing research on is being abused by their parents, you actually have a duty to report that information to police. So again, these are the things that we have to be thinking a little bit about, right? Under the category of legal harm. That brings us then to, well, the end, which is what are we actually submitting for this module? I've been talking now for a little more than an hour about unethical research and how do we make sure research is ethical and why it's important. We get now down to the nitty gritty, which is, well, what do you actually want me to do for this module? What we want you to do for this module is we want you to conduct a harm assessment for your approved study design. So again, your study was approved in module 3. We're not going to ask you to make any modifications to that study, but we want you to go through and we want you to do a harm assessment. And so what we want you to do is we want you to imagine, just for this module, imagine that you are actually going to take your study design and you are going to do it using real human participants. Okay. We want you to do a harm assessment on that basis. And the way you're going to structure your harm assessment is for each of the 4 harms on the previous slide. So the psychological, the social economic, the physical, and the legal. For each of those 4 harms, we want you to assess what is the likelihood that that harm would occur through our study design. Is it low, medium, or high? And what is the magnitude of the harm? Is it low, medium, or high if it were to occur? So how likely is the harm to occur? And if it does occur, what would be the magnitude? What degree of harm would they experience? And as it says here, we want you to, in both cases, so for the likelihood and the magnitude for each of the 4 harms, we want you to provide a brief explanation. So we don't want you just to make a chart and say, legal, low, low, physical, low, medium. I don't want just a chart there. I want for every likelihood and every magnitude for each of those 4 harms, we want there to be a brief explanation for your assessment provided. And it goes on to say here, your explanation should be, wherever possible, justified by research papers. And so I want to give you a bit of an example of that. Okay. So I'm going to go back here. Here are my 4 harms that we have to think about. And I want you to imagine that I'm doing a research study where my question is, does vitamin D intake increase testosterone levels in men with heart valve defects? This was my approved research question. And I've designed a study where I'm going to be giving men vitamin D. I'm going to be monitoring their testosterone levels, and all these men have heart valve defects. So when I'm going through and I'm doing my harm assessment, how can I incorporate some literature-based justifications into my assessment here? I'll give you a couple of examples. So I'll start with physical harm. So this is what I've written here as my physical harm. I've said vitamin D supplementation has been shown to cause aortic stenosis in rabbits. And there's my reference to it. So supplementing human patients with known heart valve defects may heighten their risk of circulatory failure. We should carefully monitor patients for any signs of hypoxia throughout the experiment. So this is my kind of justification. And again, I've used research to justify my assessment here. So my assessment, basically, I haven't really said whether it's low, medium, high, etc. But my assessment here is that there is probably a I don't know, a low likelihood of this happening. But if it does happen, maybe a medium magnitude, on the basis that, look, I know that vitamin D supplementation can cause issues with the heart, at least in non-human participants. And so if I'm giving vitamin D to people who have known heart conditions, again, this could actually exacerbate those known heart conditions, right? So again, the likelihood of these, I mean, I don't know how frequently. I have to go back to the Friedman study and see how many of the rabbits actually got aortic stenosis. Maybe it was 1 out of 10 rabbits. I don't remember. But I'd have to say, okay, I think my likelihood here of this happening is low. But if it does happen, it could be a medium or high magnitude. And sort of here's my research-based justification. As another example, we'll think about the psychological harm for a second here. So I've written that increased testosterone levels had minimal effect on mood and behavior in men, even at supra-physiological doses. And I've given a reference here to Yates et al. Therefore, it's unlikely that those individuals receiving vitamin D supplementation, even if it does boost their testosterone levels, will experience any psychological harm. So here I'm likely saying that the likelihood of psychological harm is low, the magnitude if it occurs is low, and here is my justification. So this is what we're kind of looking for you to do. We're looking for you to, again, assess the likelihood and magnitude of each of these 4 harms for your study and to provide an evidence-based justification for that assessment. Okay? So you're going to, I'm going to go back here. So you're going to do that. You're going to submit it via Quirkus, like you submit all the modules, and the TAs will then evaluate their work and either approve it or reject it. If they reject it, you'll get feedback and you'll make the changes that they've asked you to make. And of course, if they approve it, then you're fine and you'll move on to module number. All right, I'm going to stop talking because I realize this is a very long video, but a lot of it had to do with talking about that indigenous residential school study that was unethical, which I think is actually a really important study for people to be aware of, especially uh, anybody studying in a Canadian university. So yeah, I hope you have a good time going through and kind of assessing the harm of the study that you proposed. We always get some studies every year that are pretty highly unethical studies, and they're always interesting to think about. So in any case, I will stop talking. I will see you in the next module. Take care until then.